slave trade has been considered the worst violation of human rights. Now, over 400 years ago, this trade did happen when people were moved across the Atlantic Ocean to other continents. America, they were also moved to Europe and to other parts of the world, majorly from Africa. And this day, where it's International Day of Remembrance of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade, is a day to remember and honor those who lost their lives in the course of this trade, those who suffered losses as well in the course of this trade. Today, we have Tamunokuro Obietonbara, who is a writer and Pan-Africanist. He joins the show virtually this morning from Abuja. Thank you for joining. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for having me.
All right, on a day like this, it would be expected that it's a time for sober reflections. It would be time for Africans, especially who were the largest victims of slave trade, to reflect on what happened over 400 years ago when African ancestors, people were moved from here to other parts of the world to build their economies, and they were sold as slaves. First, what should come to mind on a day like this, given the fact that even in this day and time, we still have slavery happening?
Yeah, so on a day like this, I think that the statement we should make is never again. Never again will such evil befall us as a people, because slavery was what actually gave birth to colonialism. It was what opened the door for Africa's colonialism, Africa's eventual conquest. And when we look at the world today, even though we claim to be free, but the truth remains that Africa, is still being exploited. We may not have physical chains, but our political and economic systems um, are still being controlled by the same people who, masterminded the whole process of slavery, and they invent the subsequent colonization. And so uh, nothing really has changed to a very large extent, because we are still within that system of that system, of slavery, because slavery introduced a concept or an economic concept known as capitalism, because Africans were the first stocks and bonds on Wall Street, and the practice of chattel slavery is what will eventually give birth to the economic system known today as capitalism. You see, so capitalism was founded on the backs of Africans that were the first stocks and bonds of Wall Street. So as and so it's imperative that we look at our history collectively as African people, and we say never again. Just like uh, uh, some of the Jews will say that never again will they suffer such level of genocide, such level of Holocaust, as was experienced during the Second World War. And I like calling it the Second European Tribal War, because it was more of a tribal war than a world war. So they made that decision to say never again will that happen, and they've stuck to it. But the truth is that as African people, we've suffered way more indignities. We've suffered way more genocide. We've suffered way more Holocaust than what was experienced by the Jews. Are we talking about what happened? Let's even take away slavery, the brutality, and everything that accompanied it. Let's even come to the era of colonization. In the Congo, King Leopold murdered around 15 to 20 million African people. You know, uh, and, and today we all act like that was nothing. We've not taken that firm decision to say never again. Today, Congo is still bleeding. Congo, the richest mineral-wise, the richest country on the planet, is still being exploited, is still disorganized. A guy called Sissy Rhodes will murder around 50 million Africans in Southern Africa. And we're not even having that conversation today. And the Germans will carry out the first genocide in Africa, in Namibia, when the people, the indigenous people of Namibia were almost exterminated by the Germans. So the German Holocaust, the first German Holocaust actually happened in Africa, and we're not even having that conversation. People still honor someone like King Leopold today across Africa. People honor the likes of Cecil Rhodes, and people, Africans even take scholarship in honor of Cecil Rhodes. But this was a man that was responsible for the extermination of over 50 million Africans across the Southern African axis. So we, on a day like this, I think that the resolve should be collectively as African people that we should say, never again are we going to suffer such indignities. But unfortunately, we are not having the kind of conversation we should be having in a day like this. And we are not even aware or informed of our history, because throughout my educational process in this country, no one ever mentioned anything about the transatlantic slave trade to me. And it's not something, this is something we should teach our children from primary school. Children from nursery school should be informed of the transatlantic slave trade. But I went through the educational system without even being told, without even being informed that such thing happened. And so there are millions of Africans who do not in detail know about the transatlantic slave trade. And so when they see, for instance, Grenadians or Bajans, or they see African Americans, they see Jamaicans, they don't understand their connection with these people. They don't understand that these are our people, that Black Americans are actually our people. Jamaicans are our people. The Afro-Brazilians are our people. The Afro-Latinos are our people. The people in Haiti, these are our people. The Black people in Dominican Republic, the Black people in St. Lucia, Caribbean islands, these are our people. They were stolen from us. These were victims of the first war that was waged on us as African people. And so in a day like this, we should be asking ourselves, what measures have we put in place to ensure that such indignities do not befall us? We haven't done anything in that regard.
Thank you very much, Tamunokuro. Thank you so much for that elaborate beginning. Now, you said we should begin to think never again as Africans. But first of all, do you think Africans, by way of their actions, they have, had a deep reflection on what transpired during those years? And they have, by way, not just having a deep reflection of what happened, but they have, learned a lesson or institutionalized what you think should be a collective plan or framework or blueprint for the whole of the African continent to make sure that this does not happen again, and for them to equally themselves have a proper remembrance of something like this?
Well, no. No measures have been put in place, and that self-recollection, is not there. And again, it is as a result of what I call lack of historical information. Because something happened, something led to the enslavement of African people that began in 1441, when a group of Portuguese, I call them pirates, they call themselves explorers. When they would capture the first group of African people around the Senegal, Mauritanian axis, and they took them to Portugal and presented them as gifts to notable figures across Portugal and even to King Afonso. Something led to it. And so if we want to talk about slavery, we need to look at the beginning or the events that ushered in the transatlantic slave trade and the brutality that was unleashed on African people. So in 711 AD, a group of Africans called the Moors. Moors means black people. The Moors, went over to Europe. They were the ones who went and chased the Visigoths away from Spain, Portugal, and part of France. Now, the Visigoths were a very brutal race of, they were Europeans as well, very brutal. And so when the Africans went there, they chased the Visigoths out of Portugal, France, and Spain, and these Africans would establish a civilization in that part of Europe. And from 711 AD, they ruled over that part of Europe. The Africans will rule Europe, and they will build institutions such as the first well-structured university in Europe called the University of Salamanca. These Africans, over time, were opposed by, Europeans who felt that their presence was not needed. Now, over the centuries, because Africans ruled Europe for over 800 years, from 711 AD to 1492. But over the centuries, there was now these rebellions and attacks against these Africans. The last stronghold would fall, the last strongholds of these Africans would fall in 1492. And so there was now this resentment, that the people of Europe had, against these Africans. And that resentment would translate to every dark-skinned person across the world. So there was this uprising against African people, and the first group of Africans actually were those who, the Moors, who were, who were captured, who were doing the uprising, the Moors who became victims of the uprising by, Europeans, by the people in Portugal, by the people in parts of France and Spain. They were, the earliest group of Africans that would be enslaved. But now, like I said, the rulership of Yoruba Africans officially ended in 1492. But in 1441, a group of Portuguese pirates came to the shores of West Africa and captured the first forms, the first group of African people that would be taken back to Europe, that and officially enslaved. And in I think in 1440, in 1452, in 1452 to 1455, the Pope, then Pope Nicholas V, would issue a series of Papa Bulls, that would codify the enslavement and the subjugation of African people. I'm going to read part of that Papa Bull that was issued by the Pope, giving Europeans the legal power to go and conquer and enslave and subjugate African people. Now, if you permit me, here is just a part of the Papa Bull, or a part of the statement by Pope Nicholas V, from 1952 to 1955. Part of it states, to invade, search out, capture, vanquish, and subdue all Saracens, and quote, pagans, whatsoever, and to reduce the persons to perpetual slavery, and to apply and appropriate to yourself and successors their kingdoms, communities, principalities, dominions, possessions, and goods, and to convert them to your personal use and profit. Now, this palpable, or this statement, this policy guideline issued by Pope Nicholas V, is what they will officially use in their war against African people. But this war, like I said, was targeted originally to the Moors that were ruling, that have ruled Europe for over 700 years, or 800 years. The black people that have ruled Europe for over, roughly 800 years. But eventually, they would extend their hatred and their campaign of brutality to all Black peoples. And so they came they came over to the continent. Now, people in the continent do not even know what was going on in Europe. They didn't know that there was this reconquista, as they call it, against African people, in Portugal, in Spain, in France, across Western Europe. They didn't know that, but then they became the victims of it. And that is what will eventually lead to what we will call racism today. So we need to understand what happened, and we need to realize that conquest or reconquista, as they call it, was what led to slavery and was what also led to colonization and the subjugation of the continent and what we now have today as neocolonialism. And so when we want to address this issue, we should be very holistic. We should know where we are coming from. We should know what gave birth to it, or what gave rise to it. We should know where it arose from, and as people, we need to tell ourselves the uncomfortable truth that we are we're the source of raw materials, that has empowered or has made some of these countries economically viable. So there is a lot of soul searching, and there's so much that we need to think about. We haven't done any of it. We're just completely cut off from our history, and so the things that we perceive that is our history today are things that we were told to be our history. You see, we don't know where we're coming from. We've lost touch with our identity. And so it becomes very easy, because when a man doesn't know where he's coming from, he cannot even tell where he's going. It becomes very easy to manipulate, and that's where we are. But
let's take it up from knowing where we're coming from, so that Africans are not manipulated. The theme for this year's International Day of Remembrance of Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade is acknowledge the past, repair the present, build a future of dignity and justice. Acknowledge the past, repair the present, build a future of dignity and justice. So we're going to take it step by step in acknowledging the past. Now, while you were responding to the first question on what comes to mind when we think about the transatlantic slave trade and the fact that there is still slave trade ongoing in modern times. Now, you mentioned a name that Africans or the world honor without knowing the history, the man or the role he played in slave trade, or not treating Africans right when they got to America. So if we look at notable figures involved in slave trade, we'll find a lot of them who are foreigners or foreign names. We also find African names. We also find Nigerian names. I'm going to call for you, I'm going to read rather, two notable names involved in slave trade, which are Nigerians. So, Nwabani Ogogo is a Nigerian slave trader who gained power and wealth by selling other Africans across the Atlantic. We also have Babatu, also known as Babatu, is a famous slave trader. He was born in Niger, and he conducted slave trades in northern Ghana. We also have a lot of other names. And we have Queen Elizabeth I, who actually lent 2 ships to carry out slave trade. They were involved in 2 voyages. So if we have to know where we're coming from, acknowledging our past, we have history as a subject in Nigeria. How come that a lot of people, particularly young people, do not have some of these facts? It was Africans that were sold as slaves. Why didn't Africans document these trade These notable figures, Africans who sold other Africans, foreigners who dealt or who treated Africans badly, so that in acknowledging the past, we know the roles that they played and take action against people doing the same thing, becoming notable figures in society and being awarded, being praised, and even honored for amassing wealth from slave trade. What did we do? What did Africans do wrong? And how did Africans get it wrong to the extent that this documentation was not done by Africans, that now Africans are told by foreigners what they need to hear about slave trade, not what they need to know?
Okay, thank you. So let's get one thing first. There is a difference between slavery in the African context, which is more of indentured servants or indentured servitude, and chattel slavery. I think most times we mix the two. We use, when we talk about slavery, there is a distinction between what was practiced in Africa, which is indentured servitude, then, or rather, to chattel slavery. And this is not to make an excuse um, to those peoples who, on our own side, who participated in selling fellow, I would say, Africans. But then let us also understand that the concept or the identity of Africa, or rather that we are Africans, wasn't even there, let's say 500 years ago. People identified mostly with their ethnicities or with their tribes than with a collective continental identity, And so the people who partook in this, they most of the people, in as much as there were raids conducted to sell people, some of the people also were victims of prisoners of war, intercommunal clashes, and again there are instances of intercommunal clashes that were instigated, by uh, by Europeans so as to get, prisoners that they would eventually ship to the other side. Now, I do not know, and I'm not holding brief for these horrible, excuse my language, Africans, I will call them today, that took part in this process. I do not know if they really understood what chattel slavery was, or the system of slavery that was practiced, in Europe, in America, in the United States, and in the Caribbean islands, where most of these people were shipped to. We're talking about 12,000 ships. You did mention Elizabeth, giving two ships. There was a total of documented so far. It could be more, but documented a total of 12,000 ships that embarked on over 40,000 voyages from 1619 all the way to 1940, when slavery ended in Britain, and 1840 when slavery ended in Britain, and 1865 when slavery ended in America, in the United States. Now, 1840 was when, though there was a transition period before 1840, but 1840 was when it officially came to an end. So the lack of documentation, I would also allude to, I think to some extent, to the ignorance of the magnitude of what was being done to these people that were being shipped across the Atlantic. Maybe for them it was just another day, another day for trade, another day for business, another day to make some money. But on getting to the plantations, they were stripped of every form of human decency and every form of human dignity. Unlike the indentured servitude that we had across the continent, where now in quote, slaves, will get married and have children, and will eventually live their lives, in peace. But this was not the case at the other side. Children, people were forced to breed, just so the children can be used, to fill in the plantations. Men were sodomized, women were all sorts of horrible things that one cannot, say on public on public TV. So there's a clear difference between indentured servitude and chattel slavery. And I think the conversation today is being centered on chattel slavery, which is what the transatlantic slave trade was about. Now, we have failed. There's no excuse. We have failed to let our people know what happened. We failed to properly document these issues. We failed to inform our children. And I think that part of the reason why our society is the way it is today is because of the lack of information. Because what do we find today? Though in a different context, but the same scenario, where our politicians are selling us for a few trinkets. Our politicians today, they take our resources, they ship them over to the other side. They have investments across the Western world. They have hundreds of millions of dollars that they won't even spend throughout their lives, stashed away, while our people are denied the very basic things of life. So there's a nexus between the practice of slavery and the trauma and our inability or what they say about people that have become victims over time, how they extend the damage that has been done to them, how they start inflicting themselves. I think that we have this damaged psychology, due to what has happened to us over time, that we are now just doing to ourselves collectively. So if we have an honest conversation as to what has happened to us, and we, inform ourselves accurately and set up institutions to ensure that these things do not happen, that maybe our society will be different today. But so far, we've not done what needs to be done. We've not informed ourselves. We've not informed our children. And so the system, though the faces have changed, the players have changed, but the system is still almost the same. We have a whole lot to do, and that's also, again, why I say I'm glad we're having this conversation. And I hope that, policymakers will listen to what is being discussed and will, look for solutions to address these issues that confronts us collectively as a society.
Thank you so much, Tamunokuro. Now, I remember when you just mentioned our politicians ferrying away our resources to save abroad and invest in other climes. I'm going to come to that conversation. But what I want to ask is, currently, as it is, what can we do to undo the damage that has been done to us psychologically, mentally, as a human being by virtue of that slave trade? What can we do ourselves? What can we do as Africans ourselves, whether we are doing it through education or through any other means? What kind of remedy is available for Africans to take on to completely erase that damage or to heal themselves from what transpired in the past?
I'll call it reorientation. And the first thing is to understand our history, know our contribution to the fund of world civilization. Now, like I always tell people, slavery is not the beginning of African history. Slavery actually interrupted our civilization or our history. We are a great people. I just mentioned earlier, for almost 800 years, Africans ruled Europe. Now, before then, we had great empires across Africa. we come from men and women that gave civilization to the entire planet, men and women that traveled the world, giving civilization, educating people. Even the first European that was educated, that became literate, Omar, that wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, he was educated at the feet of our ancestors. They taught him, and when you talk about uh, um, you talk about Aristotle and Plato, Hippocrates, Socrates, all the pre and post Socratic philosophers, they all came and received their education right here on the continent of Africa. Eventually, uh, I think it was in 1333 BC that we first got invaded. The first invasion of Africa led by Alexander, that they call the Great, happened in 1333 BC. And so from 1333 BC to 639 AD, Africa came under, that was a period of almost 972 years. Africa came under, European or the Greek and Romans, who rule part of Africa, especially the northern part of Africa, Kemet, which they now call Egypt. Kemet and the Sudan areas, came directly until 639 AD that the Muslims, under the command of Caliph Umar, will chase the Greeks, the Romans out of that part of the continent. Now, it's imperative that we know who we are. It's important that we understand that the notion that we are inferior, the notion that we were civilized, we should take it out completely. That's not true. As a matter of fact, it's the other way around. The notion that, for instance, university education is Western education. That's not true. We should throw that notion away. Our uh, from ancient Ghana, all the way to Timbuktu in Mali, the University of Timbuktu, across the continent, the University of Wagudu, that was in ancient Ghana. Our ancestors were the first people to come up with the concept of university education. And then we had the likes of Mansa Musa, that was the richest man in human history. These are the kind of men and women that gave birth to us, that we come from. We are from the Oyo civilization. We are children of the Oyo Empire. We are children of the Shongai. We are children of the Benin Empire. We are children of the Wagudu civilization. We are children of ancient Zimbabwe. We are children of the Tassili civilization. We are children of the Kemetic civilization. So we should know that we come from a great history and a great legacy. Yes, along the line, we got interrupted. We somehow fell. But we don't have to remain on the ground. We need to pick ourselves up. We need to do what the Chinese have done. The British waged war on the Chinese, took Hong Kong from the Chinese. The Japanese, would colonize parts of China. But today, look at what the Chinese have done to themselves. They've said never again. They were able to develop a system of government that works for them without borrowing any kind of government, any kind of style of government from anywhere. They developed their own system of government, and it has led them, or it has brought them out from poverty to prosperity. So to heal, you cannot use the system designed to oppress you to heal. Again, part of the reason why we remain disorganized is because we're practicing, for instance, Western democracy. Why are we practicing Western democracy? That cannot work. We can't go anywhere with it. We just our situation will keep getting worse because.
Let's look at how we can repair the present, because the theme is acknowledge the past, repair the present, and of course build sustainable future. So if we are to repair the present, it seems like it's out of the hands of Africans almost totally, because those who were sold as slaves have settled in other lands. They've had even more than first generation, second generation, even third generation, that the current generation Sometimes some of them don't even know how they came to be in the land where they settled, what they call their own. They do not even identify as Africans. And we find that by virtue of this transatlantic slave trade, what we now have globally is racism and prejudice. How do we repair that, given the fact that it's not totally up to Africans right now because of the dynamics?
Okay, so if I get the question correctly, you're talking about the descendants of the transatlantic slave trade who do not uh, know where they come from, or who do not you know identify that they are Africans. I think that's what you said.
And even for those in Africa, there's kind of a disconnect. They're seen as other people, not exactly as Africans, because there are new dynamics to it. For those in America, for instance, you will call them African Americans. There is a new identity that they have. For those in Britain, they're different people. Those who settled in Haiti, they're different people. Those who settled in other parts of the world, they are different people. They're not exactly seen as Africans because there's a new mix right now. So I'm saying, how do we repair the present given these dynamics and the fact that it's not totally up to Africans? There's racism, there's prejudice that is not really within the control of Africans. So how do we repair the present?
So I've always recommended that every African country should have what is called the African Diaspora Ministry, which is which will aim to reconnect Africans on the continent with Africans in diaspora, especially those who are Black Americans, who are Afro Latinos, African people in places like Colombia, in places like Brazil, in Haiti, and across the Caribbean islands. And so far, I have to say that Ghana as a country is doing something remarkable in that regard. Ghana as a country has been giving citizenship to lots of the descendants of chattel slavery. Ghana has been at the forefront for this. So we should applaud the government and people of Ghana for recognizing the importance of this and for taking appropriate steps and ensuring that there is a reconnection between those in the continent and Africans in the diaspora. I think that Nigeria should also do something about, Nigeria should do a lot more in recognizing our connection with, the children and great grandchildren, great grandchildren, and the descendants of the victims of slavery that are scattered across, across the world. Yes, it is not up to us, solely to make that connection. But you see, we need to understand that there is also a policy, official government policy directives to ensure that Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora do not have any sort of political or economic alliance. It's a fact. You know, uh, I'm gonna. There's a document known as Memorandum 46. I think you should Google it. You should read it. It's a very interesting document. I came across the document when I was writing. I was looking for. I was researching materials for my book, and Memorandum 46 was written by a man called Zbigniew Brzezinski. And he and Eric Kissinger, were those who shaped US foreign policies in the 70s and 80s. These are very notable figures. And if you permit me, just to tell you, by the way, this document was submitted to the Pentagon, to the CIA, to the White House, and uh, if you permit, I'm going to read out just a section of this document. It's called Memorandum 46, and it is part of the 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 policies implemented to ensure that there is no connection between Africans on the continent and Africans in the diaspora. Now, part of this document states appropriate steps to be taken inside and outside the country in order to inhibit any pressure by radical African leaders and organizations on the US Black community for the latter to exert influence on the policy of the administration towards Africa. In order to prevent such a trend and protect US national security interests, it would appear essential to elaborate and carry out effective countermeasures. Continuing, and elaborating US policy towards Black Africa, listen to this one. Due weight must be given to the fact that there are 25 million American Blacks whose roots are African and who consciously or subconsciously sympathizes with African nationalism. Therefore, special clandestine operations should be launched by the CIA to generate mistrust and hostility in America and world opinion against joint activity of the two forces, that is, Black in America and Blacks in Africa, and to cause division among Black.
That you're reading can be said to be some conspiracy theory, don't you think so?
I'm telling you, I just told you, it is Memorandum 46. It's an official. I don't do conspiracy theory. I'm a writer. I write books. So I don't do conspiracy theory. It's an official US government document. It's out there. It's online. You can find it. Memorandum 46. This is a policy directive to ensure that African people do not unite with their brothers and sisters, across the world. It's happening. And the reason why that must happen is to ensure that Africans do not come together to say no to the exploitation of the continent. We're talking about slavery, but I'm telling you that nothing has changed. The dynamics are still the same. Look at what's happening in the Congo. Look at what's happening in Sudan. Look at what's happening across northern Nigeria. Look at what's happening around. Look at what's happening in in this country just by Mozambique. See what's happening in Mozambique. Look across. You think anything has changed? The dynamics is still the same. We were exporting our people to fund and to fuel their civilization. Today, it's our resources, our raw materials that are being extracted and exploited. While, tell me, if slavery has changed, tell me, how is it that you that have the diamonds and the golds and you that have the oil, you that have the raw materials, the coltan and the cobalt, why are your currencies undervalued? Why are your currencies weak? Why should the currency of Congo be, weaker than the currency of let's say Norway, or of let's say the UK? Because you have the raw materials.
Thank you very much. Let me come in here, Tamunokuro. Thank you so much. Now, in this line, yes, thank you. In this line of argument, now, I just want to make sure I'm extracting the right information from you. Objective information, not the right, sorry, the objective information. Now, these days, yes, we can say the Europeans and they were responsible for coming into the shores of Africa to carry out slavery and other dastardly acts. But currently, in this dispensation, talking about the lithium and other mineral resources that are scattered in the face of the African continent and how they kept on doing it, do you think they are repeating what was done in the slavery era, or this time it is the negligence, the unintelligence, and the betrayal of African leaders that are intentionally giving out Africa for that purpose? And in that particular sense, how can we salvage this situation?
So it's twofold. Yes, you have your leaders who are deliberately, mismanaging our countries for their selfish interests. But again, on the other hand, we have had African leaders who, were passionate to get a job done. And we see over and over again how such leaders just get killed, they get removed from power. There was Kwame Nkrumah, there was Patrice Lumumba, there was Thomas Sankara, and so on and so forth. Even my godfather, the late Jerry Rawlings, he was president of Ghana for for almost 20 years. And, he was having this conversation with me once where, he and Thomas Sankara had decided that they were going to have a sort of alliance. I mean, they will still have their countries, but they're going to come up with, same economic structure. They will mesh their economies together. They will have a single currency, have a single foreign affairs policy, and so on and so forth, as a way of giving more leverage to themselves. And what my godfather, the late Joe Rawlings, former president of Ghana, told me was that this plan, it was in the works. It was still a secret. But Thomas Sankara, who was the president of Burkina Faso then, would mention of this plan they've had in a public forum, and the following week was assassinated, was killed by Blaise Compaoré. And you see today that the African countries that are still under the control of the French, are not even allowed to make up any sort of independent economic decision for themselves. Now, I don't know how much time we have, but I need you to look at the economic situation, of most of the African, the so-called Francophone African countries. Now, they are, in a nutshell, they are still being enslaved. The French still determines what happens in those countries, economic and political wise. That was why you see that's why you now see the rebellion from countries like Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, and a few other countries that, like, finally, we want to wake up, we want to be free. So yes, there is the negligence, and the corruption and the selfishness of some of our leaders, but there is also the deliberate efforts being put in place to ensure that we do not also have leaders that can really give us their best. And every single time we've had leaders that try to change the narrative, we all know what happened to them. In 2015, take for instance what happened here in Nigeria. 2015, we had an economy that was over $560 billion. Today, our GDP is less than $200 billion. Today, you're telling me that from 2015 to 2025, 10 years, we lost almost how much? Almost $400+ billion, just like that, without going to war, without any economic sanctions being placed on us. We were the third fastest growing economy in the world. Today, we're not anywhere to be found. Our best talents, our medical doctors, our engineers, our best talents have all left. So to go service a system, that has been extracting our raw materials, extracting our strongest men and women during slavery, extracting our resources in this present day, creating the situation to ensure that the best talents keep leaving our shores to go serve them. Nothing has really changed, truly. There's no better way to look at it. Nothing has really changed. So yes, we must hold our leaders accountable. Our leaders are solely responsible for this. And I'm not passing the blame. I'm just saying that we need to understand the international dimension to our problems, but we are responsible 100%, because at the end of the day, it's a dog-eat-dog world. At the end of the day, we live in a world where the strong will always consume the weak. That's just what it is. I don't blame them for what they're doing. They care about themselves enough. They want their survival. They want to
As we wrap up on the discussion this morning, let's look at how to build a future of justice, so that there is that a sort of like closure and a way to heal. So if we look at the call for reparations that have been ongoing, there have been calls beyond the U.S. for reparations for Africa's contribution to their economy, even building their infrastructure. So do you think that reparation is what will bring that justice that Africans seek? Because we're talking about building a future of dignity and justice, where reparation equal justice. And if at the end of the day, the big powers, the countries the nations that have been asked to pay Africa reparation, if they do decide to pay eventually, what do you think it should be used for in Africa and for those who were victims of slave trade spread across the globe?
Yeah, reparations, will go a long way. We need to, if I doubt, how soon that will happen. But if we really want to, heal and move away from this, I think that reparation is a long way to go, especially for our people in those countries that were, um, enslaved, uh, Black Americans, our people in look at Haiti today. Haiti, part of the reason Haiti is poor is not because they don't have resources. Part of the reason Haiti is poor is because because Haiti was the first place where, African people rose against slavery to say enough, you know, um, and for that reason, for having the audacity or the nerve to chase the French out. The Western countries came together and put a blockade on Haiti. So Haiti was just a country free from slavery. Black people were now in charge of their destinies, but they can no longer trade with other countries. The only way they can now trade, was for them to pay compensation to the French for rebelling against slavery. And so for so many years, Haiti was paying billions of dollars today, in compensation to the French for rebelling against them. I think that, if we have an honest conversation, the countries like Haiti needs reparation. They need their monies that were paid. I mean, how do you pay someone? How do you pay someone compensation for brutalizing you? How do you pay someone compensation for enslaving you? For taking your dignity away. So there is a need for compensation. There is a need for reparations. And if that ever comes, I think that we should spend, the money should be used to empower ourselves economically, but also empower ourselves intellectually. Because if we're not free mentally, we will go back to the chains. If we're not free mentally, we'll remain slaves. The conversation should be, but even if we don't get that reparation or get that compensation, what we are saying is leave us alone. Leave us alone. Let us chart our own course. You don't want to pay Africa reparations? Fine. Just leave us. Can you just leave us alone? Just leave us alone to chart our own course. Leave us alone to come up with our own blueprint. Stop interfering in our affairs, because every single time you interfere, things go from bad to worse. As we saw in 2015, when US President Obama even issued a statement asking Nigerians to vote, for the new chapter, vote against Goodluck Jonathan. And we saw how that ended up. So just leave us alone. Let us make our policies ourselves. Leave us alone to drive our own growth. Yes, the funds, if it ever comes, should be used to economically empower ourselves. But more importantly, it should be used to empower our minds.
Thank you so much, Tamunokuro Obietonbara, who is a writer and Pan-Africanist, for joining the show all the way from Abuja and sharing your thoughts on this day as the world celebrates victims of slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade this day.
Thank you for having me.